Greetings and welcome to today's On With Life webinar on essentials for post-stroke nutrition. My name is Dave Clark. I'll be your host for today's event. This is the fourth webinar in our series of stroke rehabilitation webinars. If you missed one of the earlier webinars, all of them are available on the On With Life website. There's no cost to view any of the webinars, and each webinar is good for one contact hour of continuing education credit. After you viewed a webinar, just complete the evaluation and you'll receive your certificate. All right, well, let's get started with today's presentation on essentials for post-stroke nutrition. Our presenter today is Lisa Tiedemann, a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and a certified brain injury specialist at On With Life. Lisa has been with On With Life for about a year and a half. Prior to that, she worked as a registered dietitian for Land O'Lakes School District. She completed her dietetic internship at the James A. Haley VA Medical Center in Tampa, Florida, and she's a graduate of Iowa State University. As our featured presenter today, Lisa will be leading us through the rest of the webinar. So with that, Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, Dave. Again, my name is Lisa, and we're going to be talking about essentials for post-stroke nutrition. So, regardless of the title of essentials, it's still complicated because we're dealing with people and individuals. And so there's a lot of things for us to think about when thinking about post-stroke nutrition. So I like this graphic because it kind of shows all these different pieces of a puzzle. So we're thinking about what was their pre-injury lifestyle. Were they a foodie? Did they eat just because you have to? You know, what kind of thoughts or beliefs or values did they have surrounding food, including different cultural beliefs or religious beliefs that are really going to continue to be really important to them post-stroke? What are current physical abilities? We'll talk about physical and cognitive challenges in just a minute, as well as comorbidities that affect nutrition, such as type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and chronic kidney disease. Those are all things that we commonly see in people who have suffered a stroke. Additionally, current nutrition and hydration, that's really important to keep in mind, that there's this belief that, if someone comes to us and their BMI would indicate that they're overweight, that does not mean that they're not a nutrition risk. You can have a person who is considered malnourished and also has a BMI that's overweight or obese. So what's happened in the last 30 days is what's most critical, as well as their goals. So again, sometimes I find that someone who is losing weight or is not eating or is having some nutrition barriers after a stroke, I'll go to them to try and problem solve, and they'll say to me, well, I wanted to lose some weight anyway. So that's kind of a situation where we have to find a middle ground between their goal might be to lose weight, but also we need to make sure that they're getting proper nutrition and proper hydration, and how do we kind of meet in the middle on those things. So one of the biggest barriers after a stroke to adequate nutrition and hydration is dysphagia. So dysphagia is the medical term used to describe difficulty or pain when swallowing. Dysphagia itself can lead to reduced food and fluid intake. If you're having painful swallows, that obviously is going to cause you to not want to eat as much. Sometimes dysphagia causes reduced intakes because of the dislike of texture modifications. So one way that we keep people safe when they're experiencing dysphagia is to have texture modifications on food. So it might be as extreme as having to puree everything they eat, or maybe just grind up meats, or there's all different levels of texture modification that might be indicated for someone who's experiencing dysphagia, as well as thickening liquids. So liquid might need to be thickened all the way to the consistency of honey in order to make it safe for someone. So texture modifications, a standardization initiative was started in 2002 by what is now the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And that was named the National Dysphagia Diet. And that was to kind of find standardization so that when a speech language pathologist does a video swallow study or evaluates someone for their swallow, how do they say what texture that food it should be, what texture that person is safe for? So more recently, the National Dysphagia Diet has been transitioning to the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative. otherwise known as IDSI. You'll hear that, it's a mouthful, you'll hear it referred to as IDSI frequently. So what IDSI does is it takes the National Dysphagia Diet and it makes it even more standardized, more user-friendly, and it also standardizes the methods and the testing of how to know of modifying foods and fluids. So how do I know what each level really means? How do I test for that? So its biggest thing is safety. So this is a little, if you're familiar with National Dysphagia Diet, this is going to look much different. The IDSI has 7 levels that includes liquids. They don't separate out food and fluids into 2 separate things. It's all in the same scale. And they color code them so that if you're buying prepared items, it can be color coded. They number them to make it more universal across different countries, different languages. And again, the language is very user-friendly. It's very specific to what that type of texture modification is doing. If you need any more information on IDSI, we won't get too into it right now. Just know that it's the latest standardization for texture modifications. There's their website on this slide. It's idsi.org, and they have all kinds of all of their standards for how to modify foods, how to test foods for proper modification, what all of the different levels mean, what foods belong in each level, and things like that. So I encourage you to take a look at their website for more information. So that's dysphagia. That's, that's kind of a more of a straightforward one. If someone's experiencing swallowing difficulties, we can texture modify their food to make that swallow less painful and to make it safe for them to continue eating and drinking. The next one isn't quite so straightforward. So oftentimes after a stroke, we see where someone suffers from just a lack of appetite or low intakes. So a lack of appetite is kind of a general term that can come from a lot of different places. It can be a direct result of the injury to the brain. It can be depression. It can just be simple food preferences. Medications, definitely. We sometimes see people that are taking Ritalin or different antidepressants that can affect appetite. Bowel issues, and also those texture modifications aren't always appetizing. So bowel issues are a big one after stroke in general. They don't always affect appetite, but they're very, very common after stroke. So sometimes when we see them affect appetite, it's constipation, obviously, when you kind of have that bloated feeling and you don't really feel like eating. I've also seen where having frequent loose stools affects appetite because people start to associate that I eat and then maybe I have loose stools later. And my choice rather than having to experience that is to just not eat. So there's 3 big things that play a part in bowel regularity: physical activity, which is difficult after a stroke, fluid intake, and then fiber intake. So both soluble and insoluble fiber have benefits for overall health and bowel health. It's difficult, especially when you're getting texture modified food, to get enough fiber. So we think of high fiber foods as seeds and nuts and different vegetables that are difficult once you're on a texture modified diet. So in that instance, we often see where bowel supplements or fiber supplements are used. In that instance, psyllium husk is the most effective supplement as it addresses both constipation and loose stools. So psyllium husk goes into the bowels and forms a gel, and that gel both pulls water into the bowels to help with constipation and kind of solidifies the contents of bowels to address loose stools. So after we kind of figure out bowels a little bit, like we said, that texture modification is often a barrier in itself. So part of the problem is that, when you look at it, it doesn't look as appetizing. And sometimes we need to really keep in mind when we're preparing it to keep that food as close to the original as possible. So for example, if someone's getting a pureed hamburger, if I like ketchup and mustard on my hamburger, I'm gonna want ketchup and mustard on my pureed hamburger. If I am eating pureed soup and I enjoy crackers in my soup, I'm going to want crackers in my pureed soup. So making sure that the texture modified food is as close to the original as possible, including any condiments and sauces and things like that. Additionally, make sure that texture modified food is at the proper temperature. Cold food is never good. And if we cook the food and then we put it in a food processor to modify the texture, it's going to cool that food off really quickly. So to make sure that we're reheating that food or doing what we need to do to ensure that it's warm enough. Along those lines, don't forget, make sure there's to stir it up well. We don't want hot spots. So this is just an example of that. If you take a look at this, when I look at this, I get hungry and I can imagine kind of what this smells like, and I can identify all of the items on this plate and know, oh, I'm really excited to take this bite of turkey. I know what I'm anticipating it's going to taste like, and it's going to be great when I eat this Thanksgiving meal. So we eat with our eyes and our nose in addition to tasting. So this is a similar meal, only it's pureed. So we can take a look and say, first of all, can you imagine how this smells, right? It doesn't look like it smells as good. It doesn't look as appetizing. And additionally, if it weren't for the labels, I don't really even know what these foods are. I don't know if it's something that I'm going to enjoy. I'm kind of scared to take my first bite of this plate. So making sure that, again, it's at the proper temperature, that if it's possible to add sauces or things like that, go ahead and do that, and to let someone know what they're getting served. Some people prefer pureed food in bowls just because it seems like a more natural way. Sometimes food of that consistency just kind of looks nicer in a bowl. And that's just a personal preference that some people have. So just be mindful of those. It's not just here's your food, it's how does it smell? How does it look? Do I know what it is? So we can't not texture modify food, or we can't, always avoid bowel issues or things like that. But we can have some strategies to increase protein and calorie and vitamin and mineral intake while we're working through some of those things. So drinking calories is normally something that is kind of not a good idea when we think about nutrition, right? Because drinking calories means that we're getting a fair amount of calories in with not a lot of effort. Our brains don't register calories that we drink the same as calories that we eat. It doesn't tell our brain to tell us that we're full. It doesn't tell our stomach to tell us that we're as full. So normally, again, these are kind of the cons of drinking calories, but in this case, it's the pros of drinking calories. So it's easier, kind of, we don't get that same feeling of fullness when we drink a shake as we do when we eat a hamburger and French fries or something like that. Also be aware of comorbidities, especially type 2 diabetes. So this is a picture of Glucerna, which is a supplement meant specifically for those with type 2 diabetes to not affect blood sugar too drastically. Chronic kidney disease is another one where we have to be mindful. There's specific supplements meant for those with chronic kidney disease. One more thing to consider when we're thinking about supplements is that they're just that, they're supplements. So if I feel like I have food intake, it isn't quite enough. Things like Boost, Ensure, Glucerna are great supplements to supplement my food intake, but they are not sole source nutrition. So if someone is not eating at all, then we need to problem solve and think of something different for them. We do need to be mindful of dysphagia, so ensuring that liquid supplements are thickened per diet orders. Most liquid supplements are a natural nectar thick or an IDSI level 1, so if that's safe or if they need to have thickener added to them. That includes things like ice cream, smoothies. If we add ice to a smoothie, we're changing the consistency of that smoothie. Ice cream melts to kind of a thin to natural nectar, but there are things like Thrive ice cream that melts to a nectar thick that also has some additional protein and vitamins and minerals. A Magic Cup, I put melts in quotation marks because it melts to a pudding thick. So once it gets in your warm mouth, regular ice cream is going to melt and become a thin liquid, regardless of how it looks in the bowl. So just keep in mind that if you're doing those things, you need to be mindful of making sure that you're having the proper thickness. So again, if somebody just isn't eating, they say they're not hungry, they say food doesn't sound good, some additional strategies are, basically communication is key here. So honor their preferences. Is there something that always sounds good to them? Even if they eat that every day for breakfast, if that's what they want to eat for breakfast, then that's what they want to eat for breakfast. So ask them, ask their family or friends if you can, what their preferences are. Ask about their pre-injury lifestyle is important. So oftentimes we hear someone say, I never was a breakfast eater. I would eat a big lunch and dinner. Well, stressing them out by trying to make them eat breakfast isn't helping. So scheduling supplements or a large meal or snacks around the times that they're used to eating is often beneficial. And avoid restrictive therapeutic diets. So later on we'll talk a little more about type 2 diabetes and hypertension and some therapeutic diets that can surround those things. But we don't want to restrict and have a therapeutic diet on top of a texture restriction, or if someone's having poor intakes. So for example, here we never enact a therapeutic diet for someone that is on a level 1 or level 2, so a pureed or a ground. We only do those for someone on a regular diet or with only slight texture modifications, just because it makes it too hard to get enough. So we talked about dysphagia and just kind of a general lack of appetite. And another barrier we see often post-stroke is cognition. So what can look like a lack of appetite may actually be low intakes because of cognitive difficulties, such as difficulty attending to a meal. So if I can't pay attention to my meal, if I get 5 bites in and I'm off on something else or I'm distracted by something, it's not that I'm not hungry, it's just that I can't pay attention to keep taking bites of that meal. So having someone there to redirect a person's attention back to their meal, kind of say, oh, hey, you have more mashed potatoes. Oh, here's a bite of chicken, kind of things to kind of bring their attention back to eating. Having multiple small meals or snacks. So you only have to attend to that meal for 15 or 20 minutes, and then you can move on to something else and come back to eating at a later time. Persons may also need to be reminded that they have not eaten or that it is mealtime. So that's where memory comes into play. If I don't remember, if anyone's ever seen it's been 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you realize you didn't eat lunch and you say, oh my goodness, I need to go eat lunch. I remember I didn't eat. But if you don't have that memory, then that's a difficult thing to remember to do. It's often helpful, rather than saying to someone who's experiencing this, rather than saying, do you want to go down for lunch? Or do you want to eat dinner? To say, it's time for lunch, or we're going down for dinner. Because sometimes that open-ended question is more difficult, and it's not an easy thing for them to say, oh, yes, of course I want to go down and eat. To just, rather than giving that open-ended option, to just say, it's time for lunch. Also trying to limit noise and activity. So it's easier to pay attention and to kind of attend to something when there's not a lot of other noise and activity around. We try and balance that. Eating and meal times is a social event. And so we want to continue to have that be an enjoyable social event, even as we're working through some of these barriers that someone might be experiencing. So how do we do that? How do we balance the socialness of eating in a dining room and things like that with limiting noise and activity that are interfering or maybe stressful or overstimulating for someone? So in that instance, if somebody really benefits from a quiet environment or eating and kind of more alone in a room, making sure that there's plenty of other opportunities for social interaction, or maybe letting them eat with just 1 or 2 other people at a less busy time instead of when there's 20 people. So there's a balance there between limiting noise and activity and making sure that people don't feel isolated or aren't eating totally alone. So alternately, poor memory and attention may also cause overeating. If you've ever eaten a whole bag of chips or a whole thing of ice cream in front of the TV because you didn't realize you weren't attending to that food, you were just kind of eating it and paying attention to something else, your attention was elsewhere. That makes it difficult, so you don't feel as full and you're don't have the same level of satiety. Additionally, just as we said previously, that sometimes if someone doesn't remember about lunch, they may just skip it altogether. If someone doesn't remember that they've eaten lunch, they may also request to go down for lunch 2 or 3 times in an afternoon because they don't remember that they've already eaten. So when that's the case, when someone's not remembering that they've eaten, or they're not having that feeling that I had a meal and now I feel full and I'm ready to move on to the next thing. Things like memory journals are really helpful. So whether it's a picture memory journal, if someone benefits more from pictures than written words, if it's a written memory journal, if it's an audio memory journal where they're able to say and make a recording that, I just had chicken and potatoes and peas for lunch. I had a brownie for dessert. I'm getting ready to go to occupational therapy now. Things like that to kind of be able to refer back to later to jog their memory, or even if it doesn't jog their memory, just to know that that happened. So people may not always be able to initiate that or be the one that completes that, but involving someone in that is really important. So if someone has a memory journal at the end of a meal saying, okay, let's write this in your memory journal for later. One more post-stroke kind of barrier to adequate nutrition and hydration is fatigue. Fatigue comes at someone from multiple different places. People are often deconditioned. So they've been in a hospital, maybe lying in a hospital bed, haven't been doing much. Their brain and their body are making huge efforts to heal. So if you look at someone, it doesn't look like they're doing a lot of work, but on the inside, their body is doing all of this work to heal post-brain injury. So both of those things can cause some extra fatigue. For everyone, chewing and swallowing take energy, but if you're experiencing that dysphagia, chewing and swallowing problems, that increases the amount of energy that it takes for someone to eat a meal. Sometimes we'll see where texture modifications are ordered because chewing and swallowing takes so much energy for someone that they can't complete a meal. So the easiest thing for them to do is to have that food already ground up so that they're not chewing quite as much and they're able to eat more before they get fatigued. Again, in this instance, supplements and liquid nutrition are helpful. Drinking does not take as much energy as eating. Or snacks that don't take a lot of chewing, such as cottage cheese, scrambled eggs, or yogurt. Incorporating snacks throughout the day and at bedtime. Bedtime snacks are great to get a little extra nutrition in before bed. Just be mindful of safety concerns of not having someone laying down while they're eating or keeping upright for at least 30 minutes after finishing their snack. And in that instance specifically, try to make those snacks nutrient dense. So what little intake someone may have before they become fatigued, make that intake count. And finding out when someone is most awake and take advantage of that time with a supplement or a snack. Again, just as with low appetite, a lot of this problem solving comes from communication between you and the person, between you and their family, between you and other staff. Other staff are often a really great resource for when someone is most alert or when they feel like somebody would be most able to attend to having a snack or drinking a supplement or things like that. So this is just a repeat of our previous slide, and it kind of goes back to all of those different things that we're thinking about as we're problem solving. We have to take all of those things into account. Their pre-injury food preferences and their lifestyle pre-injury, their current physical abilities and cognitive abilities, and then any comorbidities that might be affecting nutrition. One other way in which type 2 diabetes might be affecting nutrition is gastroparesis. So if someone previously had some elevated blood sugars causing gastroparesis, that's something that you maybe need to speak with their doctor about and investigating that a little bit more if you suspect that that's behind some of their low intakes or lack of appetite. All right, so those are, before we can get to kind of what are some really good dietary practices, we have to get someone to the point where they're eating enough and drinking enough, right? So it doesn't matter, kind of like we said with therapeutic diets, it's hard to do a therapeutic diet for someone who's just barely eating. That's, you know, that's kind of not appropriate at that point. But once someone is doing, you know, good with eating and drinking, we've problem solved that part is generally temporary. And sometimes that's helpful to say to people too, we're problem solving through this part where eating and drinking is hard, and it's temporary, and we'll come out the other end. And once we come out the other end, now we're thinking about how nutrition, rather than how the lack of nutrition is negatively impacting someone, how good nutrition can positively impact someone's rehab and recovery after a stroke. So why is nutrition important post-stroke? So first of all, if we're talking about post-stroke nutrition, having had one stroke is a major risk factor for having another stroke. So we're behind the 8 ball a little bit. We already have one major risk factor for talking about post-stroke nutrition. The other major modifiable risk factors are diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and smoking. So you can see that 3 of those 4 have a nutrition component to them. Additionally, other modifiable stroke risk factors, overweight and obesity, unhealthy cholesterol levels, and specifically unhealthy diet also all have a nutrition factor to them. So we have, this is just some science behind, we know that heart disease and cholesterol levels and cardiovascular health are major risk factors for having a stroke. So one way, the American Heart Association is a really, really great resource, and they have developed something called Life Simple 7, and they're just 7 metrics to kind of measure heart health. Just a quick check. How does my blood sugar look? How's my blood pressure? My blood cholesterol? How's my diet? What's my weight? What's my level of physical activity? What's my smoking status? And it's kind of a very non-judgmental, objective way. We're going to do this. We're going to look at this Life Simple 7, we're going to get a score, and we're going to take that score and say, okay, where am I in the red to the green? And also then, where can I make improvements, or where can I make changes? And so again, it's kind of, instead of coming at someone with, you know, what might feel like judgment to them, it's a number, it's a scale, we do it, and then we say, where can we go from here for what we know now, where we can make improvements for cardiovascular health. This is just also saying that one of the biggest, as far as this is concerned, the top risk factor related to disease burden was suboptimal diet, which again makes sense because of so many of those things have a nutrition component to them. So again, this is an opportunity for education. Just sitting down with somebody and doing a life check to determine what their score is. Again, it's just a score, it's not a judgment. And it's just finding areas as a springboard for setting goals or for future education topics, or just so that they know, you know, kind of where they're at, and then allowing them to decide what they want to do with that information. But they have to have that information first. So we talked about in that there's blood sugar was one of those seven factors. And so type 2 diabetes is characterized by a glucose dysregulation. So it begins as insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. We can prevent pre-diabetes from becoming diabetes with diet and lifestyle changes. Once pre-diabetes develops into type 2 diabetes, that is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease, including coronary heart disease and stroke. So it's something we really want to pay attention to after a stroke. One of the first things that comes to mind is sugar-sweetened beverages. So they're responsible for 1.8 million new cases of diabetes could be attributable to consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. The tact that we take here is that we do not provide, we provide juice, fruit juice, but not sugar-sweetened beverages in the sense of soda or sports drinks or anything like that. So if that's something that somebody wants, their family is welcome to bring it in, or they're welcome to have someone else bring that in, and we'll make that available to them. Keep it in the refrigerator for them, but it's not something that we provide. So we're kind of finding that balance between setting up a healthy food culture and role modeling and things like that, with allowing people to make their personal decisions, and it's up to them to just make that decision on if that's what they want to do or not. So when we get persons served with type 2 diabetes, it's a great opportunity for education, for nutrition education. Many people come to us never having had nutrition education about their diabetes. They may have had it, but it was 15 minutes in the doctor's office. They might not have paid close attention, honestly. It's a hard, nutrition and health is sometimes a hard thing to understand the connection, because it's pretty abstract. It's hard for me to understand sometimes how what I'm eating affects my health when it's difficult to see those direct relationships. And it's something that's happening on the inside. And I don't see the manifestation of that until something bad happens, until I have a stroke, until I start having eye problems or nerve problems or things like that. So this part of recovery is really a very teachable moment, because it's kind of real in that moment that, I need to maybe change some things about my health. Alternatively, aphasia and cognitive difficulties might make that opportunity for education a little more difficult. It's important to tailor education materials to individuals. One great way to do that, we use both our facility menus and occasionally food diaries as educational tools. It makes that education more concrete. So I can sit in a room and talk about carbohydrates and all these foods that you may never eat or you don't care about. But if I say, let's keep a food diary, and you do that, and then we go through the food diary and say, okay, which of these foods have carbohydrates? How much carbohydrates? What's an appropriate serving size? What is some way that we could do this differently? So instead of drinking a big glass of juice, having half a glass of fruit juice and an apple. The facilities menus are another great tool, because it's very reinforcing day after day after day. They see the facility menu that's providing that education and that reinforcement. I like to think of our facility as being the role model, the menus as being the role models, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So this is simplified diabetes education. When I print this out, the pictures are on the front and the words are on the back. It's good for someone who's suffering from aphasia, because pictures are often helpful. It's good for those who are getting this information maybe for the first time, because it's very to the point and very simplified. There's not a lot of details. It's just, it is what it is. Here's what affects your blood sugar. Here's your blood sugar goals. Here's the complications of increased blood sugars. Once someone is ready, this is kind of a more detailed piece of education. Again, it still has some pictures. It's pretty limited in details. Doesn't get into a ton of details. It's just a next step. This is what I mentioned earlier, using our menu as a teaching tool. So this is what our menus look like for those that are on a consistent carbohydrate diet for type 2 diabetes. Up at the top, it lists kind of their carbohydrate goals. It's not that when you have diabetes, you don't eat carbohydrates or drink carbohydrates. It's that we're trying to keep those consistent, not have big spikes and have a ton, and then blood sugar spikes as well. So there's a goal, how many carbohydrates are in each of those items. Again, it's just repetition. If I can see over and over again what items have a higher carbohydrate content. And then also some idea of portion control. So it's not that there's no rice, it's that rice, there's a portion of a half a cup of rice. It's not that there's no dessert, it's that there's a small portion of that fruit fluff. Again, the way that we design our menus is that if you choose the special, you're within that carbohydrate guideline. So it's menu as a role model. It makes it easy. If I just choose the special every day, I'm within those guidelines. I'm where I want to be for those things. The other big comorbidity that we see with stroke is hypertension. So lowering blood pressure seems to be the most beneficial for reduction in risk of stroke. And sodium reduction is the key dietary component to reducing hypertension. So many persons, again, come to us never having received much education on this. And it's really important to make healthy eating the default or the easy choice. So we have a sodium goal of 2,300 milligrams per day. And if you choose the special, you'll be within that sodium goal. So we make the kind of the sodium goals and the carbohydrate goals the default or the easy choice for people. There are a lot of good external resources for salt and sodium education. This is the American Heart Association, the National Kidney Foundation. So these kind of talk about some areas where there's a lot of sodium, where we get a lot of sodium. According to the American Heart Association, more than 70% of the sodium we eat comes from packaged and restaurant foods. So that means if we're looking to really reduce sodium, it means less restaurant foods, less eating out, and fewer packaged foods. So what does that mean? That kind of means cooking. It means two things, and one of them is cooking. So how do I learn how to cook? If I'm a cook and I'm used to adding salt and using salt, how do I learn how to season things and cook without using that same amount of salt, or without using prepackaged spice blends, which can contain a lot of sodium, without using seasoned salts within those things? So we do a lot of cooking education, and people can take this home with them about how to cook without using salt. The other thing is that we're never going to get away from packaged foods totally. So reading labels is really critical also. So when if I'm making homemade soup because it's lower sodium, and I want to know, how do I compare chicken broth at the store to know I'm getting the lower sodium version of chicken broth? Reading nutrition labels is also critical for carbohydrates as well. Again, there's a lot of great pieces of education out there that you can just print out if you want to. Or sometimes we will make our own here that might be more specific to someone who's suffered a stroke, or someone who has diabetes or different comorbidities, or just what they like to eat and what they like to cook. So those kind of address those two risk factors or comorbidities that we often see with stroke, which is hypertension and type 2 diabetes. But what about kind of the rest of kind of a general overarching diet? So again, this is kind of a puzzle, like when we have, an individual. And so when we think about, you hear a lot about healthy lifestyles or lifestyle changes and all of those things. And these are all just part of that. So mental attitudes is a big one. Diet, hydration, physical activity, comorbidities, and support. I think support and mental attitudes are much more important than we give them credit for. Mental attitudes, I have to want to do it, right? If I don't understand the importance of it, or I don't want to engage in this, it doesn't matter. I can have all of the education in the world, but I don't want to do it. And even if I want to do it, I'm going to have a hard time doing it on my own without the support of others. So those are two big ones. And I think that as a facility, we can play really big roles in how we approach things can really affect people's mental attitudes, and how we approach things kind of sets that first line of support for someone. So there's dietary guidelines for Americans are just general healthy lifestyle guidelines for everyone. So oftentimes what I tell people when we're talking about nutrition, even if it's for diabetes or if it's for hypertension, is that all of these are recommended for everyone. This is the same advice. No one's getting singled out. Nobody has to do things now that they, didn't have to do before. It's that these are the same guidelines I would say to any person who came to me and wanted to know about good nutrition and healthy lifestyle. So these are the 5 guidelines. They're just kind of general guidelines. Again, on the right, we have support healthy eating patterns for all. These are the key recommendations. It focuses a lot on how many servings of vegetables, how many servings of fruits, grains, whole grains, fat-free or low-fat dairy. You will see that in the dietary guidelines for Americans. Not all dietary patterns that list dairy, but in the United States, we drink a lot of milk, and so that's included in there. A variety of protein foods, limiting saturated fats and trans fats, added sugars, and sodium. So again, this is for everyone. So even if someone has hypertension and we're talking about reducing sodium, it might be more critical in that instance, but it's still a guideline that is worthwhile for everyone. These are just more specifics. Consume less than 10% of calories from added sugars and from saturated fats. This is where that 2,300 milligrams per day of sodium goal is. They do mention alcohol, consuming alcohol in moderation. Now, alcohol after a brain injury is not, is contraindicated. So it's never recommended to drink alcohol after a brain injury. So oftentimes if I'm doing different pieces of education, I will just take that piece out instead of saying, oh, if you consume alcohol, kind of saying no alcohol, or just leaving that out altogether and making the alcohol discussion something for a different time outside of nutrition. My plate is we saw the graphic on one of the diabetes pieces of education. It's just a graphical representation of the dietary guidelines for Americans. And it just makes it kind of a meal by meal idea rather than 5 servings of vegetables per day. It's what should my plate look like? So it's much more user friendly. We have it hanging up in our dining room just as a reminder. Make half your plates fruits and vegetables. It's much more general than the dietary guidelines for Americans, but just a great little thing to have on there. The National Stroke Association also specifically has guidelines for nutrition post-stroke. They are pretty much the same as the dietary guidelines for Americans. Again, no one's getting singled out. It's the same idea, you know, what's a good idea is a good idea, whether it's pre-stroke or post-stroke. So these 3 diets are all very science-based diets. So you can find a lot of things on the internet, but we want to think about what has really been looked at, what have scientists taken a look at and found to be helpful over and over and over again. And so those 3 diets that we found to be most helpful that have a scientific basis to them are the DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet, and the MIND diet. So we'll start with the DASH diet. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It was developed to reduce, prevent or reduce blood pressure. It's a specific eating plan, and one of its main components is reducing sodium. So it increases fruits, vegetables, fat-free or low-fat milk and milk products. Those are all low sodium items. Whole grains, fish, poultry, beans, seeds, and nuts. Beans, seeds, and nuts in themselves are very low sodium. We just have to be mindful of how we're preparing them. It contains less sodium, sweets, added sugars, and beverages containing sugars, fats, and red meats than the typical American diet. It has increased amounts because of that dietary pattern. It has increased amounts of potassium, magnesium, calcium, protein, and fiber, which are also beneficial for heart health. So again, the DASH diet mirrors that 2,300 milligrams per day. It goes further to suggest that once you're comfortable with that and able to meet that reducing sodium further to 1,500 milligrams per day has added benefits. So again, here we do the 2,300 milligrams, but sometimes if someone comes with more severe heart problems or following a heart surgery, their doctor may recommend that 1,500 milligrams to get those additional benefits. Whole grains for most grain servings. This specifically says 3 servings of low-fat dairy per day. That makes it a little bit unique. And then the number of servings in fruits and vegetables depends on your calorie needs. So if you need 2,000 calories, 4 to 5 servings of vegetables. If you need 2,600 calories, you don't make up that extra 600 with a candy bar. You say, okay, I'm going to eat another serving of vegetables and another serving of fruit and maybe another serving of milk and protein and things like that. So again, this is very specific. It's kind of regimented. There's specific numbers depending on calorie levels and how many servings per day, and all of those things are per week. The Mediterranean diet is a little bit differently. The Mediterranean diet wasn't developed by science, it was discovered by science. So it's one of the most researched diets along with the DASH diet. There's also a Mediterranean diet pattern in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans that's a Mediterranean diet that's been Americanized. And research has shown that it reduces the risk of heart disease and diabetes. It emphasizes primarily plant-based foods, whole fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, so beans and things like that, and nuts. Replacing butter with healthy fats such as olive oil and canola oil. Again, there's the sodium, using herbs and spices instead of salt. Limiting red meat, enjoying meals with family and friends. That is that support component that is important. And then it does have the red wine. Again, I just leave that off. Getting plenty of exercise. So you might remember we used to have a food pyramid here, and that got switched to my plate. There's a Mediterranean diet pyramid out there. This is a great graphical representation where we see all of those whole fruits and vegetables, whole grains on the bottom, and then some lean proteins, and then as we kind of get up to the very tippy top, red meat and sweets at the very tip top. And then again, the wine, I would just take that off if I were printing this to hang up. And that one does have the water rather than milk, because again, this was developed in other countries and discovered in other countries, and so they don't typically drink milk. So now we have the MIND diet. So the MIND diet stands for Mediterranean Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. So we said the Mediterranean dietary pattern says is mostly plant-based, minimally processed, cereal grains, legumes, vegetables, fruit, nuts, fish, small amounts of red meat, milk, and dairy products. We had the DASH diet that also emphasized fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy products, whole grains, poultry, fish, and nuts. And what happened is that they took these two diets and put them together for the Mediterranean DASH intervention. And so what they're looking for in this instance is that taking a little components of both of those and specifically promoting an increase in the consumption of berries and green leafy vegetables with limited intakes of animal-based and high saturated fat foods. So they took the Mediterranean diet, which is best when it comes to heart health, the DASH diet, which is best when it comes for hypertension. They combined those things, and its main aim is to slow cognitive decline and prevent dementia. So stroke survivors suffer from much higher rates of dementia than others. So that's what this diet is looking to avoid. It lists 10 brain healthy food groups. So these are positive. We want more of these. Green leafy vegetables specifically, along with other vegetables, nuts, berries specifically, beans, whole grains, fish, poultry, olive oil. Again, the wine is not appropriate after a brain injury. It also has 5 unhealthy food groups. So it's trying to make these as little as possible. Red meat, butter and margarine, cheese, pastry and sweets, and fried or fast food. So there's a lot of foods in between that kind of fill in the gaps. We're trying to increase the 10, decrease the 5, and then we kind of fill in the gaps of what's left with all the rest of the foods. So it's found to be one of the easiest diets to follow. Here's kind of what a little infographic is of how do you follow the MIND diet. So you can see it's much less specific than the DASH diet and a little more specific than the Mediterranean diet. So it's still giving you some real numbers and some real guidelines, but not quite as regimented as the DASH diet. So again, it's one of the easier diets to follow. So that's a lot of information. So what can we take from those diets and put together? So we have Dietary Guidelines for Americans, we have DASH, we have MIND, we have Mediterranean. So what do those have in common that we can say we know that across all of these science-based diets, here's what they have in common. So the sodium intake, less than 2,300 milligrams per day, fewer processed and fried foods, including fewer pastries and sweets, more whole foods, including whole fruits and vegetables, making our proteins lean and plant-based, more whole grains and complex carbohydrates, and less simple and added sugars. So it helps to use, again, using an additive approach rather than saying you shouldn't eat this or you shouldn't eat that. If we add more fruits and vegetables to every meal, if we add fish in twice a week, if we add nuts and fruits and veggies as snacks and dessert, sometimes naturally some of those less healthy foods will fall away. So if we add fish in, maybe we're taking away a hamburger at that meal. We're having fish instead of a hamburger for that meal. So rather than think about you shouldn't have a hamburger, it's easier to think about what can I add in to make my diet healthier. So what we're trying to add in are things like lean beef and fish and chicken, so those lean proteins. A couple of those specifically mention fish, but even if someone doesn't eat fish, having those lean proteins, as well as plant-based proteins. So beans and nuts and seeds and legumes are great sources of protein and do have a double whammy. So they're also great sources of fiber. They have a lot of vitamins and minerals in them. So they're a great source of nutrition in general. What we need to be mindful of is how we prepare those. So in themselves, they're really great. They're low sodium. They have all of these great nutritional components. Once we have salted nuts, now we're adding in a lot of sodium. So thinking of unsalted nuts or lightly salted. Beans, if we're getting them from a can, getting low sodium beans and rinsing them. Or just using dried beans, cooking beans from the dried state so we control how much sodium is in them. We're adding in whole grains, starchy vegetables, and whole fruits. Again, with starchy vegetables, the secret is in the preparation. So a roasted potato, like what's pictured here, has potassium and different things. If we're going to assume that that seasoning is sodium free, that we added on there before we roasted them, versus a fried French fry. That's not the kind of starchy vegetable that we're trying to include in our diet. Whole grains, most things say at least half of your grains should be whole. That's a really good, if you can make all of them whole, that's great, but most people aren't quite ready to make all of their pasta and all of their rice and all of their everything whole grains. So realistically, we say make at least half of your grains whole. When it comes to fats, we're trying to add in more unsaturated fats. We're going to limit saturated fats and try and stay away from totally trans fats. Nowadays, trans fats are being banned in some places, so it's getting easier to do that. We don't have to read a label or do a lot of research if they're just banned, but right now that isn't everywhere. If you read a label and it mentions hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, then that item has trans fats in it. Those are the big keywords. Hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated are an indication on a label that something has trans fats. Also, things like pastries and donuts, fried foods are sources of trans fats. Saturated fats are things like red meat and butter and cheese and high-fat dairy. And unsaturated fats are things like fatty fish, olive oil, canola oil. Again, those nuts and seeds, avocado are all sources of good unsaturated fats. This is a big one because for a long time we heard low fat, low fat, low fat, which we know now is not the case. The case is what kind of fat. We want to really pay attention to what kind of fat. So we have love it, limit it, and lose it. Again, this is the American Heart Association. It's a great graphic just to reinforce that it's not that we need it to be low fat, it's that we need it to be the right kind of fat. So again, if we take all of this information and we break it down, can we break it down into just a few key ideas? And these are the key ideas that we focus on here. Again, we want to have like a positive food culture. We want to be the role models. We want to make the food culture here kind of the role model for when someone discharges and goes home. If you could think back on, you were able to do it here. What have I been doing over the last 60 days on with life that I can continue at home? And to know that, one of the big things with nutrition is to know that you can do it. So if you're practicing it here, when you go home, you know it can be done. So the big things that we focus on, reducing sodium to 2,300 milligrams per day or less, avoiding trans fats, decreasing saturated fats, focusing on unsaturated fats, choosing lean proteins and plant-based proteins, avoiding processed meats. Processed meats have a lot of saturated fat and a lot of sodium. So they're an easy one to say, let's try and avoid those if we're trying to keep sodium and saturated fat low. This first one I just think is funny. Eat food, mostly plants, not too much. It makes it sound simple, right? There's the essentials for post-stroke nutrition. Make half your grains whole grains. Reduce processed foods. Again, that's a great way to increase nutrient density and decrease sodium, is to eat whole fruits and vegetables. And then you decide how you season them with some of those seasonings, mixes, or a Mrs. Dash or something that's low sodium. All right, and now we have time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And now as we transition into the Q&A segment of today's webinar, I see that several questions have already been submitted. So let's jump right into it and go first to this question from Daphne. Fiber was mentioned in reference to bowel management, but the other benefits weren't specified. What are those benefits, Lisa, and what are your recommendations for fiber?
That's a great question. So fiber also plays a role in blood glucose regulation. When we eat a meal that contains high fiber, the fiber can slow down our digestion, and so it slows down how quickly any sugars or carbohydrates go into our system to avoid blood sugar spikes. You might have heard that fiber has a positive impact on cholesterol levels, blood cholesterol levels as well. I mentioned it specifically, it has a really direct effect on bowel movements that you can easily see. That's something that isn't on the inside, right? That's something that we can see on a day-to-day basis. And I think that if someone is interested in a fiber supplement, making sure that that fiber supplement addresses the issue that they want it to. But if we really are following those dietary patterns of including more fruits and vegetables, including more nuts and seeds, including whole grains, those all contain fiber. So if we're really doing a good job of doing that, fiber kind of follows along with it and all of the health benefits that it has.
All right, next up, let's go to this question from Emilio. How does weight loss fit into post-stroke nutrition?
So we hear a lot about weight loss, and there are some statistics out there that will talk about, weight loss in diabetes and hypertension, weight loss, even a 5 to 10% weight loss can have really beneficial effects. What I found is that weight loss, again, is something that in the moment, in kind of the immediacy following a stroke, isn't always something that people are ready to focus on. So if we focus on, rather than kind of the number on a scale, if we instead focus on eating more fruits and vegetables, or reducing added sugars and things like that, we're still getting all the benefits. Even if you don't lose weight after making those dietary changes, you're still getting benefits to heart health, benefits to blood sugar, and all of those great things. Oftentimes, weight loss will naturally follow that. And so if that comes as a happy fringe benefit, then that's always fine if that's what someone's goal is. But I find that it's easier to focus on the dietary patterns and then kind of let the weight loss come as a secondary.
Here's a very succinct question submitted by Ria. The question is simply, what about supplements?
So we talked briefly about supplements in regards to if someone has really low intakes, but I think oftentimes people want to know about supplements as it comes to vitamins and minerals, and can I take, if you go to the vitamin aisle at Target or at Walmart, there's rows and rows and rows of supplements that purport to have all kinds of different benefits, right? So oftentimes, if it's just a multivitamin or just a vitamin C, then, those often aren't harmful. Sometimes, they aren't very cost effective, but they're not going to hurt anything by any means. But usually, my recommendation would be a food first recommendation. So if someone's able to eat enough, so we're not talking about a lack of appetite or really low intakes. If someone's able to eat enough, it's usually best to get all of those vitamins and minerals from food rather than from supplements. Having said that, oftentimes, a doctor may prescribe a supplement for a very specific something that's happening in that moment. And I don't want to disregard that at all. Those are definitely appropriate. But if we think about a general nutrition, we think of a food first approach where we're getting all of those vitamins and minerals from the foods that we're eating.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Let's go to this one now from Nicholas. Lisa, I know that you talked about the what of post-stroke nutrition. Nicholas's question is, how do we get people to actually do it?
That's a great question, because most of us know what we're supposed to be doing, right? The question is often how, or, how do I make these changes? Because change is not easy. And change is not easy in a situation where you're kind of overwhelmed, you've suffered this big life change in this moment. So I think that, as for this, that could be a whole presentation in itself, absolutely. I think that to maybe break it down to a couple key points, my first question would be to find out what someone's goals are. If your goal is that you want to be able to go home and play with your grandkids, how does nutrition fit into that? How does nutrition fit into keeping you healthy in the long term to be around for your kids and your grandkids? How does nutrition fit into that person's specific goals? Because it's not always easy to see, and sometimes it takes a new set of eyes to kind of relay that to someone. I would say the other idea is to not, sometimes people get labeled, there's a word that we use called non-compliant that I don't really like, because there's usually, most people, it's not that you don't want to, right? There's something else going on that you might be struggling with different recommendations or knowing what you're supposed to do. I'll give a really quick example. I had someone who really, he and his wife were both really motivated to change his diet to help with his diabetes. And we would talk, and then it kind of just, it seemed like it wasn't sinking in. It seemed like maybe they just weren't doing it. And when we really sat down and I took the time to really talk and get to the bottom of it, I found out that she had suffered from food insecurity at one point in her life. And the idea of any kind of restriction, now they had access to whatever they wanted. And it was really hard for her to kind of make those choices because of something that had happened in her past. She wasn't trying to not do it. It was something else going on there. So really talk to people and figure out what's important to them and what do they want and how can we help them get to those goals.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. This one was sent in by Vera. What about non-compliant people, Lisa, or those who just aren't interested? Any advice on that?
I think that my biggest piece of advice is to just meet people where they're at. If there's anything that they want to do, being respectful of that and mindful of that and being willing to support them in whatever it is that they want to do. But you're right, some people just aren't interested. And I think if we start with a judgmental approach, or if we start telling people that they're wrong or things like that, it's their body and it's their right to decide what they do with it. And if it ever comes to a point where they change their mind, which I've seen happen, I want to be that positive person that they know is in their corner and that they know is here to support them, rather than them feeling like, oh, I'm going to hear I told you so, or they're, this person hasn't been a very positive, person in the past. So I think just meeting them where they're at and being there and available and supportive if they ever do decide that they want to do those things.
Okay, well, I think that is just about all the time we have for today. Thank you very much to today's featured presenter, Lisa Tiedemann. Before we wrap things up, I just want to remind you that if you missed any of the earlier webinars in this series, all of them are available on the On With Life website. And again, there's no cost to view any of the webinars, and each webinar is good for one contact hour of continuing education credit. After you viewed a webinar, just complete the post-webinar evaluation form to receive your certificate. Thanks so much for being with us today. That does conclude today's webinar. Have a great day.